Welcome back to this very important podcast on climate. To my understanding, this is the first of its nature when it comes to my journey with the podcasting for 2 years now. And there was no other better person to have been my guest on this very important conversation than the one I have after I have been waiting for a month or two for the response from her side. She is Bharati Chaturvedi and founder and director of Chintan, Environment Research and Action Group. Has You can just check her out on different television channels and different debates. She has been part of a very lovely and beautiful work when it comes to climate. For this conversation, I have been waiting a lot and a long also. My audience has been consistently writing me to have someone from the climate so that we can check out what are our confusions and what are our expectations from this type of a conversation. Welcome to the podcast, ma'am.
Oh, my pleasure. I apologize that it took you so long. I had a extremely ill mother, so I started prioritizing her. I'm her primary caregiver.
Okay, we can understand, and it has been a wait worth it now. So I'll
Well,
just
it's worth
start.
it for me. Thank you.
I'll start with first thing is that what is the current scenario when it comes to climate discourse in India? Because of a rush for urbanization, because of the realistic challenge that we face day in and day out, at the policy level, at the social level, and also at the economic level. Where do you see this entire discourse going?
I think it's a very complex ecosystem because it's enmeshed with the vision for a economically more powerful India, but it's also stuck in a very difficult situation, which is a situation of huge amounts of climate damage. For example, the floods in Uttarakhand and Himachal and Sikkim. For example, the extreme heat that we've seen. People actually collapsing. So the challenge that we're seeing, the discourse is really, how do you keep people productive? How do you ensure that your economy is not going down because of climate change, which it will when it helps people's productivity and health. And those are also well-known crises. On the other hand, we've seen a very particular aspect of air pollution taking precedence. And it's also an interesting thing because almost 1 lakh Indians die of air pollution every month. But on the other hand, every single year we're part of this airshed and we can't breathe. And people are extremely sick, both young and older people. Therefore, I think the conversation is a very strained conversation. And while we're looking at solutions, I think there are too many pushes and pulls for us to be able to actually call it one conversation. I think one thing that I really like is the conversation about fighting poverty and about energy. And I think that conversation is a very positive conversation. Whether you look at things like the Kochi, the airport running on solar. That's not a new story anyway, but the way that we're trying to find other energy sources on one hand, but also saying that everybody deserves to get some form of energy equity. I like that we're looking at that, because without energy equity and without alternative forms, more green forms of energy, which are also very difficult in their own way, we're not going to really progress.
And this one important thing that you mentioned in your in your introductory remarks is that a country as huge as India making a transition from the traditional sources of energy to the green energy, how difficult it is. Because at the policy level, even there are hiccups, there are impediments that don't allow us to do a transition one time. And also, people say that during the COVID times, things and climate were going bit fine, and the COVID reset has
Yeah.
again, and after that, the manufacturing sector, and also apart from that, the indoor smoking, outdoor smoking, whatever the forms of emissions. Where do you see this thing, that the challenge that can we mitigate anytime soon or in the longer run? What must the government do to cater this challenge of environment disaster or challenge of climate?
The government, increasingly I've come to understand that there are three things. I think the government really has to put more taxes, because people on their own are not going to stop this extraordinarily, ridiculously overconsumption. The rich in India are so rich and they consume so many resources, and they themselves can't be stopped. People have private planes, people have 4 5 cars, and it's not just an urban phenomenon. In many villages, you go, and at least I don't know South Indian villages, I certainly know North Indian villages. There's so much wealth. You have these expensive vehicles standing there. And that form of consumption then takes away, there's only so much you can consume. A carrying capacity is only so much. So if people with power and leverage have certain priorities, then all that development is only for them, which is why everybody wants a branded hospital in their district, because that's where people who can afford it will go, whereas all the other people will continue to go for during heat strokes and other such things to the regular hospital. Instead of improving that facility, we're looking at more expensive facilities. So I think government has to have a kind of sin tax, make it really expensive to have a second car, for example, in a family. Make it, and I think government also has to give incentives for more and more people with rooftops to shift to solar, because our energy really. And I think the third thing is, people, the rich in India, um, absolutely have to, they've shown no responsibility about their extreme consumption. You only have to look at Diwali, you only have to look at New Year's, you only have to look at people's weddings. It is as if we don't have climate change. It's so irresponsible. Therefore, I think we have to put, really, the government has to really make it expensive and difficult and almost a moral problem, which is where you and me come in. We are society, people listening to this, we have to make it unacceptable and very difficult to consume beyond a certain level.
And you have been, before I can ask you and to get into this area of solutions and remedies that you will suggest as a person who has expertise at her back. The thing is that you have been talking quite, I saw your podcasts and your conversations across, and also your write-ups and the work at Chintan. It's fabulous. It's unparalleled to my limited understanding as a student of international relations. Environment just has been at the heart of your work.
Yeah.
How does it go with you? Why environment just, and what are the related areas that need a relook?
I think we have to relook at environment itself in the global south, not just in India, not just in South Asia. And for us, it should never be the Western model. We have our own models. Our models of any environmental solution in the global south has to fight poverty, has to look at gender inclusion, it has to look at making children and youth future ready, and it has to increase our resilience. Now, when you look at models in the West and they say don't do this and don't do that, and they have their own models, but they don't have our kind of poverty. They also don't have our kind of cultural heritage, which is so rich in environmental, practices. Whether you're looking at, repairing the shawl, or whether you're looking at anything else, or the tradition of handing things down to people, the tradition of commons. Look at how villages used to be. There were all these commons, right? And everybody's cattle or livestock went, even today in Rajasthan. So we have these traditions where we have the sharing economy. We have these traditions where we have the repair economy. And all of these help people not to be very poor. And we should recapture these, unlike the West. So my first point is that environment has to be reconsidered in a more global South way, or at least I'll limit myself and say South Asian way. The second thing I feel is that for me, there is no environment without people. Like, to me, a tree is a very beautiful thing. I'm really grateful that we have forests in this country of ours. but I'm also very mindfully aware of the tribal population that is greatly dependent on minor forest produce and also has a huge amount of indigenous knowledge on how do you conserve these forests. And you go to distant places like Nicobar, where the Nicobarese tribe will tell you that there's an old saying that when the ocean goes away and the sand, the beach becomes bare, you run on top of a hill. And that's why so many of them actually knew what to do from folklore when the tsunami happened. So you see, what I'm saying, we should have a very different attitude to environment because that's our inheritance, and that's how we can be an inclusive country, inclusive region.
You in a conversation with Barkha that quite years back told that smart cities are important because they are to an extent the best equalizer when it comes to gender, when it comes to caste, when it comes to class, and whatsoever. But my contradiction as a student of international or as a student of the climate is that isn't it a fine paradox and a contradiction that tech and environment don't go hands in hand, or we are short of the technologies that actually help us protect the environment?
Well, first of all, I also studied international relations. I went to Johns Hopkins and I went to SAIS.
Yeah, I
So
saw
we
that.
both studied it and we're both talking climate change today. So it's a special pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
But but yeah, talking of tech, I think there's a whole world of how access to tech is not necessarily always going down to the bottom of the last person. So there's that problem, and part of it is because of how we don't have a tech at home. If you're a poor person, you don't necessarily have a good smartphone at home. In fact, in cities, a lot of women in slums don't have smartphones, so they can never use WhatsApp or see a film. So you have to find other ways in India to talk to them about building resilience. When I don't believe I ever said that smart cities equalize caste, because I think caste is a thing in our country that's not gone away at all. It's footprinted in our imagination, and it's a very, very difficult, it's an extremely difficult issue. And we haven't really progressed in terms of looking at other people, regardless of their genius, or even if they're not geniuses. We still, one particular kind of framing of people, which is very predominant, is caste. We never progressed beyond that. We progressed a little bit. So I would never have said that any kind of city would erase caste. Uh,
No,
you know,
because maybe I couldn't comprehend it properly, but the way I understood it is
but
that
yeah, I think
smart
they are
cities,
more
smart
inclusive. They can be.
you in a conversation with Varkha, I mean on record it is. I'll just cite you the examples. It's not an area of disagreement, but as somebody who has an expertise in environment, my thing is that if smart cities, the way we have been moving from from $2 trillion economy to three. And again, then we are dreaming of living in an Amrit Kal, and then after 100 years of independence, we'll be at least flirting with the superpowers. But that having been said, my thing is that if you also mooted out this idea of co-smart cities, will you shed some light on this? Co-create smart cities?
When I mean co-create, what I mean is that, who creates cities? Typically, those who live in cities, the city's already been made for you, right? You know that there's this flyover, which is, that there's no place for you to walk. You know that the rickshawala who's coming to deliver you bought a new desk for yourself in this new city, वो बेचारा बड़ी मुश्किल से आ रहा है, पीछे भी बस लग सकती है, motorcycle ne to mari diya. Cities are very treacherous places. And when you co-create cities, you can actually make them less treacherous places. And when you co-create, it depends whom you're co-creating with. You co-create it with people who are transporters, but I don't mean necessarily truck owners. I also mean people who are informal sector actors. You'll get a very different city, and that's going to be a smart city, because it'll be, if you look at cities today, what is green about them, and who needs the greenness? So frankly, mostly workers need trees more than you and me. because they actually walk and they need the shade, and then they sit down under it. Then the nai puts up, or the barber puts up the chair under a tree. Those who are taking and cycling and delivering your things to you, they need shade, they need water, they need payouts, they need safe lanes. So when you co-create, you give these kinds of things to a majority of our city owners, and that's when a city is actually able to be more equitable. And you can certainly use tech to monitor many things, including if AQI, which is air quality index, is lower in certain places which are not motorized. You can certainly use tech to be able to look at how much certain cycles, certain kinds of transport are used. So I think tech can be used to improve cities. I certainly think that co-creation makes cities better for people who are otherwise ignored.
If we talk about your project at the Chintan, the work you look in, what are the realistic takeaways from the work you have done so far at Chintan when it comes to waste management, the people involved in the informal structures, especially, and where from this thing comes out is the environment justice. So,
Yeah.
so should also tell us something about it. What are the realistic takeaways?
So I think the one big takeaway I would give to everyone is, no matter how much funding or effort or projects you do, you from day one have to think that, my board members one day said, what's your bus strategy? And bus strategy means, if you come under a bus, what happens to your work? So I was quite shocked at the time, but it's a very valid thing. That's my core takeaway, that you have to make people strong. You don't have to make your organization strong. You have to make people who are on the field. You have to develop their leadership, their knowledge, their capacity, their entrepreneurship, and whatever, and move on. And move on doesn't mean break a relationship. It only means that you meet each other, naye saal pe and aise waise, but not in a dependence. So I think Chintan's biggest lesson is that you shouldn't create dependence on yourself. You should create these micro entrepreneurs, and to the extent that both parties, have the time and inclination, you have a camaraderie. The other thing I think is that you should really give away everything that you do in terms of what compost works, what is a good way to make compost. Just tell people, let them do it. Help people, give away everything. So you live like, if you come under a bus tomorrow, then enough people have the knowledge and they don't miss you very much. And I think the third thing is that, which I care about a lot actually, is I don't believe that we should be, I think we're too competitive and people are constantly self promoting. And I believe we shouldn't do that, because apart from the fact that life is short, uh, climate change is very rapid. And if we don't share more things, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to come up with a solution. Too often we do one or two cute projects and everybody loves us for doing them. I think we need institutional change. And I think everything that we do, even if you're doing something in your own residential area or school, or if you're a teacher and you're just teaching a bunch of students, every single thing should have two elements, is my lesson from Chintan. One is, how does it change the bigger structure institutionally, whether it's in your city or whether it's in your ward or whether it's in your country? And the second thing is, don't create dependence.
That's the point, well taken. And one last thing is that before we sign it off is the important work that you have been doing, the policy measures that you will suggest at this point in time to the groups, to the organizations, and to the, I mean, the politics of this country is such that we don't normally get people elected on the basis of climate policies, on the basis of environment. And your lessons from your work, your takeaways from your work, what do you suggest for 5 points so that anybody from the government, anybody from the academia will pick it up, so that they will back it and also talk about it in their normal conversations?
I think, first of all, I think we have to put in so much more investment in weavers, in artisanal workers, whether they're mochis, whether they're weavers, whether they're all these repair walas. To me, if you do that, you've already enhanced existing livelihoods. But there's also, when I talk of investment, I also mean not just access to soft loans or access to markets. I also mean creating demand for that. So I think I would tell the government to do that, because it's a really important way to address consumption and climate change, but it's also a great livelihood. And it's something that exists. We don't have to train people from scratch. The second thing I think is really rethink how we look at coasts in our country. We're building, everybody who has money is trying to get a house in Goa near the ocean, which I find really a bad investment, because so much, half the coastline will be eaten up in the coming couple of decades. But other than that tragedy, I also find that we have to have, I know we have coastal regulatory zone and all that, but we really have to have a much more strict thing about just not being able to do any more. What exists, please let people enjoy it. It's the regulators' fault, but that they didn't stop it. But let's not overcrowd our coasts. Let's leave our coasts be. They're really important barriers, and let's just put mangroves and other kinds of things depending on the coast. Every coast is not a mangrove coast. So I think we have to rethink our coasts, and I think it's only fishermen and people like that who need to, really be there. I think, and we should treat them as natural barriers. The third thing I feel, and I know that UK, Orissa, there are a lot of people, Bengal, there are lots of people, but I'm saying let's rethink about it. Let's really stop where we can. The third thing I think is really about carrying capacity of the Himalayas, and we have to rethink how informal domestic tourism is playing out. You're tired and you say, I have a long weekend, chalo Shimla ghumne jate hain. And we really have to think about this and find what is the alternative. You can't expect people कि हम बैठे हुए हैं गाजियाबाद में, तो भाई we're going to sit in Ghaziabad and get bored. People get bored, but what's the option? And I believe that we have to find other kinds of clusters which can divert people and which can give them both a combination of tranquility and travel and beauty. And I believe, therefore, we have to really look at nature-based solutions for some of this. And another thing I think that's very, very important is, and you might be thinking I'm not talking about waste and air pollution, I will, is really biodiversity. Our birds are collapsing. There was a State of Indian Birds by eBird and 17 other organizations. It's telling us pretty grim things. And one of the key reasons is loss of habitat. And I believe that I don't have exact 1, 2, 3, 4 lessons, because those are more complicated, but it's absolutely mandatory that we understand what is leading to this habitat loss. We re-examine how you have corridors of ecosystems instead of fragmented ecosystems. And it's absolutely essential to reevaluate what's happening to biodiversity and treat it as a crisis. So those are some. Of course, I can talk of water. I can talk of how we need to think about waste. I can think of all those. To me, the big one would be, let's not have any methane, which means every piece of organic waste has to go somewhere where it doesn't actually rot, whether it's composting or whether you're doing something else with it. Because methane is a dreadful, greenhouse gas. We know that. And we also know that it's really preventable. And if we really want to fight climate change, preventing methane through waste, which is, almost 10% of a contributor to greenhouse gases, that's a low-hanging fruit. Let's do it. Let's save ourselves.
I mean, that's really a wonderful set of things that you have mentioned. We are just short of time. Otherwise, I'd request you to also do a sequel of this podcast. I mean, next weekend or maybe after 10, 15 days, wherever the convenience of your office will be. So the simple request from my end will be, because I also run a coaching academy of kids from 8th to 10th class, and I have been always vocal about environment and climate, because back to my state of Jammu and Kashmir, there are new trajectories of development. There is also a smart city project at work. Apart from that, development in the peripheries. So my request is, if anything, if we need any support, professional support for the mooting out the projects, giving kids the chance to actually express and collect data, and also be serious about the climate issue. I request on record about your collaboration, and also our request,
We
because
would
it's
love to
about
help
kids.
children.
Yeah,
Yeah, we would love to help the youth. It is their future, and it is our responsibility to, make them future ready to the extent it's possible. So I'm more than willing, provided that the young people are more than willing,
yeah, we have all
or at least.
we have kept a provision. Once we enrolled them in, we told them that we'll be mooting out a project that each student has to, undertake. And I have a curiosity for this thing, that we must be protecting our plants, our diversity, and apart from that, also our livelihoods. What's the circular economy? How does it work? And apart from that, also, what are the alternative sources of energy? I'll be handing over different projects financed by the academy, financed by our team, so that all the students get aware and get acknowledged about the things that they must be looking at in the near future.
Yeah, I think so. And because I think also kids, young people, I would say, it's very important for them to do things with their own hands. Too often we find that, regular children, not even privileged children, they haven't even made a cup of tea and they've turned 15 because, they're just studying. I find that very strange. They've never tried to repair anything. They've never done anything in the kitchen. They've never washed any bartans. And I feel doing things with your hands, they've never dropped anything and then tried to repair it with, wo araldite hota tha pehle. All those kinds of things which makes you experience how it is to do something regardless of the result. And no children don't do those things. So I think projects play a very important role, and they also build self confidence, because when you're older, and you should have the confidence in how to do things. I don't believe, apart from very, very few people, I think an average 10-year-old child or young person today would never have repaired their clothes unless they're very poor. And I still repair all my clothes, and the reason we repair them is because that's our mindset. कि oh my god, ये
Absolutely.
फट गया, इस पे कॉफी गिर गई, धुल भी नहीं रहा, निशान भी नहीं जा रहा. So I feel doing things with your hands and learning handmade solutions is a very big way to open your mind. It's
Uh,
not labor,
you
it's a
you
mental
you
process.
you actually studied IR, international relations, like normally we students do in our current life. But why Chintan then? It must have been somewhere else where incentives were high.
I am really interested. Well, my first master's was in history. I studied subaltern history. I studied modern Indian history. And it really helped me because it made me understand fundamentally that while on one hand you could have a whole movement saying quit India, or basically the administrative independence of India, you could also have forest dwellers protesting. You could have salt farmers in Andhra saying we don't like these taxes. So it really made me understand that you could have a multiplicity of asks and different imaginations, and there's no one particular narrative. And I think it's important when you think today. I think it also taught me the importance of the subaltern, and that is, I think, been a very important very important learning, and it's really shows in Chintan's work. And thirdly, it really taught me to think gender very differently, and that also really shows in Chintan's work. And of course, I've been very lucky to have excellent colleagues. So that obviously is the main reason why Chintan does good work. It's not really me. And finally, I did IR. Well, I did, I did a lot of development courses because SciSce has this thing where you look at health and you look at the politics of health, and how vaccine became a tool of diplomacy, but you're also on the other hand understanding health, for example, or climate change. So I did things on climate change and I really enjoyed it. I mean, and also whatever I've studied, I've never really been part of that field. I've just enjoyed that studying, and but I've done what I cared for the most.
That's
Learning,
amazing. And I mean,
studying
we're
trains you to think.
the students of international relations, and apart from that, also the normal students without domain specialty are indebted hugely by the work you have been
Yeah,
doing. I mean, realistically speaking, Chintan is doing a fabulous work.
thank
But that lands us into the last part of this conversation is a book list for the students of environment science or for the students as a normal people who read a lot. What is the list of books that
you.
you will
Okay.
suggest?
So let me start. Oh, by the way, I just want to add that today's climate politics is all about international relations. I mean, you can see it. You can see the new climate blocks, and you can see the new interest groups. And I think that's a fascinating conversation for another time. Books. So first of all, you may or may not. I'm actually happy to send you some books, but I would say that you have to pick up Unquiet Woods, Ram Guha. You have to pick up anything you can find, anything, even if it's a comic, really looking at, the Chipko movement. Then I think there are these really good. It's a little bit of a difficult read, but still push yourself and read all about Patrick Geddes. He was talking about central India and cities. I'm not going to say Varya Elvin, wo to thoda, it's a little difficult to read. But I feel Hind Swaraj is also a very important read if you're looking at environmentalism. Then I would look at, I would talk about air pollution and look at Siddharth Singh's book. I think it's called The Great Smog or something. I can email it to you. I can email the book cover. It's a fabulous and important book. Then I would really, really say that more than books, there are all these little pieces on biodiversity. And if you really want to read one thing, two different things, I would say read Down to Earth and read Sanctuary. Sanctuary talks about the beauty of nature. Down to Earth talks about the politics. But you need both, and you should read both. And you
Sure.
don't have to read every single thing. Read whatever catches your fancy. I won't even tell people to read a lot more, but I would certainly want them to read a few things on, you know, if you can read, this doesn't look like it's related to environment, but I feel it is. If you were to read things related to any of the, Kumkum Sangrari's books, or, there are all these things about gender and ancient and medieval and modern India. There's Anshu Malhotra's work. All those things I feel are very important because they help you frame the question differently. So you don't need to so you need to know how to read and do those questions. I definitely want you to I want to suggest reading a book by an American writer called Elizabeth Economy, called The River Runs Black. It's about the Chinese system, economic system, and I think that's a super important book. um, so that's a very, very important book. If you don't have access to it, I will send your students my copy,
Yeah, sure.
and I can put together other books also. I'm a believer of not Pankaj Shekhsaria's book on the Andamans is very important. It's not a book in the sense that it's not a fat book. It's thin, it's brilliant, it's first-hand research. I think it's very worth reading. It's a Kalpvriksh publication. I recommend it to everyone. So I could give you a whole bunch of things to read. If you email me an address, I will courier for your students separate things.
Yeah, I'll be doing that once we are done with this podcast. I'll be doing that
Yeah,
tomorrow morning. For the short,
yeah.
for the conversation that we have, it was seriously insightful, and I loved the conversation, and I hope that my audience will also love the way you put things into a simpler form and make they will understand the things that are involved into the environment literature. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. It was seriously a wonderful podcast and a conversation after a long time, because this is the first conversation I'll be putting up on my YouTube channel of the beginning of big at the beginning of this year. So
Well, Happy
lucky
New
enough,
Year to
happy
everyone.
Happy New Year to you and your family as well. Thank you so much. Have a splendid evening.
You too. Bye.